I think we have to talk about LLMs and artificial intelligence. I think this is a topic that is in a lot of people's minds because you can't really avoid it. Even in the retro computing community, and especially in the software and software development community, you just can't get around it. And I think it's a very controversial topic. And I think that is not without cause. So I'm another person who wants to share his thoughts on that, and they are quite diverse and varied. And there's a lot of talk about a few things that regard LLMs and AI as we currently define it. And I want to do this in kind of like a chat with you. So please feel free to leave some comments. These are my opinions, obviously, and I will leave out a lot of stuff because A, I don't know everything about this topic, B, it's highly complex, and C, it would take days probably to discuss this in full. So I'm just gonna hit on a couple of points that came to my mind in the last couple of weeks, especially in the software development and open source community, which I'm very much into because this whole retro thing is just, in quotation marks, my hobby. But I do earn my money in software development, and I have been a Linux user since 1994. Currently, I'm still developing with or under Linux, for example, using Windows a little bit at work, using Linux at home and macOS at home most of the time. So I have some notes here that I'm looking at currently, and I want to touch on 5 questions basically. The first one is, what is slop? Because slop is the thing that makes LLMs terrible, from what I hear mostly. Then second, are LLMs AI? Third, are LLMs evil? And fourth, why are LLMs problematic? And fifth and last, are LLMs in the retro community okay? Can you use them? There are, of course, some subjective opinions in some of these questions, but I think there's also some objective things that I want to touch. And maybe I can come across what I'm currently thinking about this whole topic, which might change in the future. It definitely has changed compared to the past, the more I know, and so on. But first, let's quickly talk about what is slop, because people are mostly against LLMs because of slop. And AI slop is low quality but high quantity content, in my opinion. That's how I understand it. The LLMs allow you to put out massive amounts of content without much effort, and the quality of this content is often enough not very good or very homogeneous. You can basically see and feel that it was made by an LLM. This kind of content can be code for software development, it can be music, images, videos, text, or any other kind of medium. And one of the side questions is, do LLMs always produce slop? And I would say no, it depends on the user, because the amount of output that you get and also a little bit the quality depends on who is prompting the AI and how often you do it. If you do it to flood something with books that are completely hallucinated and you put out 100 books onto Amazon for print on demand, that's definitely slop. But of course, the same could be said that people use it for a certain project and they output one product every couple of months with the help of AI. I would argue that that is not slop. But let's get to that back in a couple of minutes. The thing is, the whole deal with LLMs is that they lower the hurdles for inexperienced users to produce content. Look, I made this wonderful image, or I made this program, app, whatever, without much effort, without much quality control, and without anybody having asked for it. And I think that is some kind of problem because there is no filter anymore. There's no hurdle, no effort that you have to overcome in order to produce something. And this leads to a massive growth of output from a lot of people without any quality control. So you get a lot of mediocre stuff. In other words, AI slop is basically the spam of the media world. Think of email spam overtaking regular emails for at least a decade now, probably even more. And AI slop also makes it extremely cheap to produce wrong information and put them out there on the web, like fake news and stuff. There's no rigorous research or checking of facts in a lot of AI generated content. So you can output propaganda and other stuff out there. So that's also definitely a big issue with AI slop. All in all, the signal to noise ratio on the web nowadays has been lowered significantly compared to 5 years ago. If you are going onto a web search like Google, DuckDuckGo, Bing, or whatever, and looking for stuff, you get a massive amount of hits, especially in the computer science and software development world, where you have something up to 90% of websites generated by AI and not getting the real content. It has become really hard for traditional search engines to extract useful information. Okay, that was point one. The second one, are LLMs actually AI? There's some debate, I would say, that even in research, some people say, yes, that is AI. Some say, no, it's not true AI, especially it's not general purpose AI. But the fact is, for the layman, often enough, the LLMs that you interact with, that you can use as coding assistants, they do seem to do more than just predict the next token, even if under the hood, large language models can only predict the next token. But there is differences in how these things work, like chatbots. I learned today, actually, in another very interesting video, use different LLMs that work together. One that has to interpret what the user said, one that actually builds an action plan for agentic use or working out a problem, and a third one that actually reacts to the user. Maybe I confused a couple of things, but each of those LLMs will be more or less a predict the next token thing. But if you put all of them together, they can at least put up the appearance of something more complex and something that is behaving almost human-like. But we'll get to the problematic things in a minute. The third question that I asked was, are LLMs evil? And I find this very difficult to answer because in the end, it's just a technology. But the problem, as usual with technology, is what do you use it for? How do you use it? And the current LLMs and AIs do not have ethical models or true reflection of actions that they could take. You can put guardrails in place to make them behave in a certain way, but there's so many things that you can do with prompt injection and similar things to derail LLMs, and they can lie, they can produce hallucinations, fake information, and whatever. So you can't treat them yet as a real conscious being because there is not the same things happening inside of them as are happening in humans, at least as far as we know. We don't even know yet how humans get their consciousness, how our intelligence works fully. I think a lot of things are understood, but there are probably more things that we don't understand about the mind and about consciousness than so what we don't know about that than what we know. So to be saying that LLMs are evil is, I think, cutting it short, but they don't have an inherent model of good and evil. So you have to be very careful when using them. And that also leads me to the fourth question now. Why are LLMs problematic? And there are a lot of things. First of all, the security aspect that I just talked about. You can basically not avoid prompt injections the way the current LLM architecture works. Because it is a layer of multiple LLMs feeding into each other, you can always make up the text so that the LLM downstream will get confused who said what. And that's actually called role confusion, and it will make prompt injections very easy. And it's an inherent flaw, and there's a couple of videos and papers out there that explain it in great detail. So the current architecture is definitely something that we shouldn't use if we are relying on security, especially on the web. Another thing that comes to mind is that LLMs currently are absolutely not democratic. In the past, you could basically produce software in your bedroom. That started with the home computer revolution in the late 70s, especially the early 80s. And later on in the 90s and 2000s, you could code it up in your bedroom, but you might need a server farm or the cloud to scale it up. But basically anyone could start a business in software. Open source was always possible. You could always release your source code and everybody would share in that. And that's something that you might find useful or good or attainable and valuable. But with LLMs, that doesn't work anymore. The amount of data and compute resources that you need are way too big for bedroom coders, except if you want to do small models. But the really large, really useful models, those cost hundreds of millions up to billions of dollars to train. You need massive amounts of server space and GPUs and whatnot. And of course, lots of data that needs to be scraped from the web. So that's nothing someone in their bedroom can do. You need huge companies with huge manpower and especially huge compute resources. Also, open source is not truly possible. You don't even have the source of the training data once a training run is done. You can't change anything. LLMs are more or less black boxes after the training. You can't debug them properly. It's completely different. Then you have other concerns like environmental issues. This whole computing resources and energy resources that you need is way above what we have seen before in the world. So this is something to consider as well. And with the energy consumption, you also get water consumption for cooling. That's a big issue for all the places where data centers are built. Furthermore, there's not only the natural resources like energy and water, but also hardware resources. SSD and RAM shortages and price gauging have happened now in the past couple of years, and we are more or less at the end of Moore's law. There's a little bit still to be gained, but we won't have the same gains that we had when we introduced cloud architecture, where storage and CPU were getting cheaper and faster. So when we want to make the LLMs and the AI better, we have to spend exponentially more hardware and energy. And also, very importantly, the question is, are LLMs reliable? Well, the issue is when they are right, like if they give you the right information, they can be very useful. But when they are wrong, they can be quite dangerous because LLMs nowadays lack introspection and the ability to rate or quantify their own confidence. And that's a big issue. Basically, they're lying to you, but they don't even know that they're lying. They think they know everything, but they don't know that they don't know everything and that they have weak spots. So they're basically the electronic version of the Dunning-Kruger effect. They think they are all knowing, but they will never tell you that they don't know something. And that's an issue with the current architecture again. Once LLMs or AI gains the ability to have introspection and reflection and to be able to rate or quantify their answers, then they will get exponentially more useful, because then you can ask them to give you reliable information or to just tell you, I don't know, or maybe it's this, but I'm not quite sure. I tried to force this with Gemini a couple of weeks back, and it tried to give me confidences, but it usually overestimated its confidence, and it would always give at least 80% confidence. And I think it was just trying to please me and to give me a good answer, and it didn't seem to do a proper introspection because it couldn't tell what it actually learned or what it hallucinated. So that's still a big problem, basically. This leads us to the last question. Is the usage of LLMs in the retro computing community okay? And I think that currently the usage of LLMs in everything is the wrong way to do it. People just see this hammer that is the LLMs and think everything's a nail and you can solve everything with it. I think using the LLMs sparingly and figuring out what they do work with and what they don't work with is a good idea. And especially in the retro hobby community, it might enable you to make amazing things that would usually take much longer. However, it often also devalues the work of many artists because a lot of people now use LLM generated images or music that they put into their games, even on retro platforms, because they don't either have the money to pay a pixel artist, or they don't know a pixel artist or a musician that wants to join in into the project, and they might not want to wait for someone else to deliver. And there's always the risk, because often it's a hobby, that the other person, the third parties, won't deliver and the whole project collapses. So I do see why some people do that. On the other hand, I don't like to play such games because I am enjoying the retro games because the authors and the artists wanted to tell me something and not an LLM. I'm not doing this to use it like a drug to just consume, but when I play a game like everything behind me here, which are a lot of homebrew retro games, I'm playing those text adventures or those arcade games because people spent time and they had a mission and a story to tell. And I want to hear that because then I'm interacting with those people. And with the LLM, I can't interact. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But in the hands of a good developer, and especially for development, an LLM might cut time required to actually realize a project. And I do see the benefits of that. I do have one concrete example, and maybe one abstract example where I think this might be useful. A friend of mine created a port of the classic impulse tracker software composer for the PC where you can produce mod files, Amiga style mod files. And I will put up a link in the description, and I will put a screenshot here or something. And he did this as a hobby in his spare time, and I think he wouldn't have done it without an LLM because it was quite laborious. He made basically a translation from assembly code to portable C using SDL. And LLMs actually very good at translating between different languages, both natural and formal. That's just a fact. Formal languages being programming languages. So I see the value of someone who has not much time but an idea and no one else picks that idea up, to use that to port a large-ish code base. And then, of course, this tracker still has a couple of bugs. You need to fix the bugs. The question is, will you let the LLM do that, or will you do it by hand? So I think this impulse tracker port probably wouldn't have happened without that, because there's not that much interest. On the other hand, I've seen people port weird stuff to all kinds of platforms. So a good developer with enough time and resources on his hands or her hands can definitely do that. But the question is, will all the projects that could be ever happen? And do we want all the projects to happen actually? Or are we getting into the slop area again? With this project, I would say it is not slop. It is relatively high quality, although it's still very early in its life cycle, so to speak. So make sure to check it out. And please don't hate on him. I think he did that with very good intentions. But that being said, another interesting aspect that LLMs can help with is reverse engineering. LLMs can often do pretty good analysis and summaries for engineers to reverse ancient hardware or software or protocols. Sometimes there's so much data that it would take you weeks or months. And again, this can be a time-cutting measure to get actually some of the reverse engineering projects off the ground. But once you have this analysis, you have to go over the details and you have to check every bit if it's correct or not. But it will give you a good starting point to understand a completely foreign code base that might be not well coded or something like that. And that's something I think LLMs can also help in achieving. So all in all, I think the current hype that everyone wants to pack AI or LLM into every product, and we need to do everything LLM because there's a big gold rush, is totally wrong. Also, the resource and energy consumption that we're doing. There's no throttling of anything. It's crazy, and I think that's also very bad. And I think that especially in the retro community, it is okay that projects take time. Everything that we are dealing with has been created in a time frame of at most 50 years, human lifetime, by a lot of people, yes, but there's so many great software tools not using LLM that enable people in the retro community to do so much more. Cross compilers, using scripting to generate code, KiCad for designing homebrew hardware, a lot of tools and a lot of compute power that don't require LLMs or diminishing the creative process that but still enable developers and artists to do great stuff much, much better than when people had to do all the coding on the C64 or a small Amiga 500 or something with too little CPU, too little disk space, and so on. We have so powerful computers that we can do a lot of great creative work without the need to use LLMs. But banning LLMs outright, like the Jihad in the Dune series by Frank Herbert, is also probably not the right way to go. The question is, can we find a middle ground where we use a technology responsibly without destroying everything else in the process? And I think that's a big question of the next couple of years. And the next video will again be about something more fun. But that's it for the moment. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. That will help me out greatly. You can reach me as usual on Mastodon over at chaos.social/@root42. And if you leave a comment, I'll try to interact, and I hope to get your opinions on the matter as well. As I said, I probably forgot a lot of stuff, and see you in the next video.